Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my quarterback rankings tier list for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be talking about all 32 starting quarterbacks and presenting statistics and data that I've gathered this offseason in order to justify their current rankings. Now, as I present each quarterback on screen individually, that is the order in which I would draft them from number 1 to 32 at the quarterback position. All statistics that I mentioned are for a 4-point per passing touchdown league, so keep that in mind. And additionally, the rankings on today's episode could potentially change because, as we know, rankings are always subject to change as trades, injuries, etc. occur between now and the beginning of the season. So if you want to stay up to date on my latest rankings and content, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Again, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season with the singular purpose of trying to help you guys win a fantasy football championship. Additionally, for those of you guys who want more content outside of the content that I make here on the channel, be sure to travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog Fantasy. Again, at this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get that first-time deposit match, you're also going to get my 2023 fantasy football draft guide and rankings. Those rankings updated every single week over the course of the month of August. So regardless of when you're drafting, you have an advantage upon your league mates. That draft guide goes ahead and represents my methodology as to how I approach my 2023 drafts by each position and how I draft them accordingly, and the statistics that justify that approach. Additionally, besides the draft guide, the rankings, which is by position, by tier, top 200 flex, half PPR, full PPR, 4-point per passing touchdown, and 6-point per passing touchdown. Besides all those overall rankings, you'll additionally get rankings every single Sunday morning over the course of the entirety of the 2023 season from weeks 1 through 18, which includes that week's rankings by position, by tier, with flex, half PPR, full PPR, so that you're prepared every single Sunday to set the right lineup and help yourself capture a 2023 fantasy football championship. So go ahead, take advantage of the opportunity today. Help me help you. Determine your eligibility via the map on the left side of the screen. And of course, draft responsibly via Underdog Fantasy. Thank you very much. All right, last thing I wanted to mention before we get into today's content. Again, for those of you guys who haven't checked out the merch in regards to the channel, the 1.01 brand, the official merchandise line of the Andrew Kiorkof YouTube channel, you can go ahead, travel down to the description, head on over to andrewkiorkofshop.com and potentially rep and support the channel with greetings and salutations on your chest like I currently am, and like the hoodies to the left of me obviously demonstrate. Again, like I've mentioned multiple times this offseason, the entire purpose of this merchandise line is to provide high quality, comfortable, and stylish clothing for your most stressful of upcoming fantasy football Sundays for the 2023 season. So go ahead, check it out today and get to repping. Greetings and salutations. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about the quarterback position, beginning with my number 1. It is Josh Allen. I've had Josh Allen as my number 1 quarterback all offseason, mainly because he has been so consistent throughout the last 3 seasons that I don't think he's slowing down anytime soon. Over the course of the last 3 fantasy football seasons, if it wasn't for the Week 17 canceling of the Cincinnati Bengals game last year, Josh Allen would have finished as the number 1 overall quarterback in fantasy football for 3 consecutive years. No other quarterback in fantasy football history has put up more seasons of 395 or more fantasy points within a given year in a 4-point per passing touchdown format. When we look at the overall consistency of production from Josh Allen since 2020, since Stephon Diggs joined this offense, he's been averaging 24.35 fantasy points per game and has been able to score 2 or more touchdowns in 42 of his last 49 regular season games. Unbelievable statistics, to say the least. That is an 86% rate of 2 or more touchdowns. Additionally, since 2020, the Buffalo Bills have been the number 1 offense in terms of total offensive touchdowns scored per game on average, even with 2 different offensive coordinators, obviously with Ken Dorsey last season and Brian Daboll in seasons prior. Now, last season, obviously, Josh Allen dealt with that elbow injury, but prior to the injury, he was an unstoppable fantasy quarterback, averaging 26.92 fantasy points per game from weeks 1 through 9, the first 8 games of the season. Afterward, had a significant drop, nearly 4 fantasy points per game dropped in terms of regression due to the elbow injury, but going into this year fully healthy, with new weapons surrounding him, obviously with the investment of Dalton Kincaid in the first round, new receiving options, new running backs, it's only going to help his potential going into this year. I know many people struggle with the idea that they think Josh Allen's rushing potential is going to decrease this year because they brought in different running backs. He is still going to be running a significant amount. Last season, 62% of his rushing yards were accumulated off of scrambles alone. So even if they reduce the amount of designed runs he's collecting, he is still going to be a huge threat in the end zone. Specifically, over the course of the last 3 seasons, he has scored a total of 19 rushing touchdowns in the red zone. Those numbers are going to stay consistent, and so will Josh Allen. Moving on, let's talk about our number 2, another player within the S tier. It is Patrick Mahomes. the Super Bowl defending champion, the MVP of last season, a quarterback who has been in the top 4 rankings of quarterbacks in fantasy football each of the last 3 years. He is the only quarterback in fantasy football history to have 2 separate seasons of 400 or more fantasy points over the course of the last 3 seasons, averaging 23.52 fantasy points per game, having scored 2 or more touchdowns in 39 of those 49 games. That's an 80% success rate. Now, last season, despite the fact that they lost Tyreek Hill, Patrick Mahomes had a lot to prove, and he absolutely did so with 5,250 passing yards, 41 passing touchdowns. I mean, unbelievable numbers to the point to where Patrick Mahomes set the record for most total yards by a quarterback in NFL history with 5,608 total yards. That's passing and rushing together. Those numbers will continue to pile up. Even with the departure of Mecole Hardman and Juju Smith-Schuster, they're continuing to retool this offense. And as long as Travis Kelce's there, Patrick Mahomes will continue to succeed. Not only has he proved it through the air, but he's also been very consistent on the ground. If you go ahead and take his last 3 seasons of per game stats in terms of rushing and expand it upon a 17-game season, we're potentially expecting Patrick Mahomes to have 66 rushing attempts, 363 rushing yards, and 3 rushing touchdowns this season, on top of all that he does through the air. That continues to make Patrick Mahomes an S-tier quarterback, of course. Moving on, the last quarterback within the S-tier, it is Jalen Hurts. The 3 quarterbacks that are typically being taken within 2nd or 3rd rounds of our drafts are not by accident, mainly because these guys are unstoppable in terms of fantasy purposes. Prior to Jalen Hurts' injury last season, he was averaging 26.4 fantasy points per game from weeks 1 through 15 and was the number 1 overall quarterback throughout that span of time. Now, obviously, in comparison to guys like Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes, the contributions in which Jalen Hurts provides via rushing statistics is far more significant. Even though Josh Allen has been able to compete, the rushing touchdown totals that we have witnessed from Jalen Hurts are stuff that you would only dream of for your fantasy quarterback, and he's been able to capture that and keep it consistent. If you take the last 2 seasons of overall fantasy production from Jalen Hurts and you go ahead and expand that in terms of per game averages in terms of rushing, our expectation for 2023 is about 875 rushing yards and 13 rushing touchdowns for the entirety of the season. That on top of the fact that he improved as a passer, going from a season which they had 0 overall receiving options with over 1,000 receiving yards to having both A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith both accomplish that, with the potential of which, if in fact Dallas Goedert had not got injured, he could have potentially even surpassed 1,000 receiving yards. Everything is on the table for this offense, and especially when you consider the fact that Philadelphia Eagles led all teams in terms of first half scoring last season, scoring over 18 points per game on average in the first half of games. If you go ahead and anticipate an idea in which they're not as successful in the first half, or potentially their defense isn't as successful this year, they may have to throw the ball even more in the second half of games in far more competitive matchups. That is only going to help Jalen Hurts instead of running the ball out with their running backs, killing clock, and just riding off into the sunset and letting their defense close off matchups in comparison to a more competitive season. Hopefully that'll be the case this year, because that only unlocks Jalen Hurts and his potential for fantasy purposes. If those touchdowns continue to rise within this offense, of course, his fantasy upside continues to grow and make him perhaps even a better fantasy quarterback than Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes in terms of overall potential. Moving on, let's talk about the A-tier quarterbacks. We begin with Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson has not been healthy each of the last 2 seasons, but prior to his injuries, you go back to 2021, prior to his injury from weeks 1 through 13, was the number 7 ranked quarterback in fantasy football, averaging 21.7 fantasy points per game. You go to 22, prior to his injury, weeks 1 through 12, he was the number 5 overall quarterback in fantasy football, averaging 21.3 fantasy points per game. So overall, has been a 21-plus point fantasy quarterback, and that has been in a run-first offense. Now that we go into 2023, there is the potential in which now that you go from Greg Roman, their former offensive coordinator, to Todd Monken, a guy who was a former offensive coordinator of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers back in 2018. Within that offense, they had the 4th most passing attempts at the quarterback position, which led to the most passing yards amongst all teams in the league, and of course, the 3rd most passing touchdowns. If we're going to see Todd Monken spread out this offense, a lot of 11 personnel, they brought in guys like Odell Beckham Jr. and of course Zay Flowers, paid a lot of money for Odell Beckham Jr., $16 million this season. And then, of course, utilize a first-round selection at the wide receiver position. That's the 2nd time in the last 2 years. Of course, bringing in Zay Flowers, you'll have a full healthy season with Rashad Bateman. There is potential for this offense to spread it out and allow Lamar Jackson to be the passing quarterback we all know that he can be. Now, despite all of the passing work, a lot of Lamar Jackson's contributions over the years have certainly been on the ground. I mean, when you take the averages of a per game over the course of the last 3 seasons and expand it upon a 17-game season, we would expect Lamar Jackson to have 184 rushing attempts, 1,159 rushing yards, and 6 rushing touchdowns this year. Another season of 1,000 rushing yards wouldn't be a surprise, but you have to take into account the fact that 62% of those yards that he has gathered over the course of the last 3 seasons on the ground have been from rushes that were designed to go ahead and have Lamar Jackson leave the pocket with the ball, in comparison to 38% of them being from scrambles. If you go ahead and decrease the amount of designed runs and you pass the ball more within this offense, you'll just get more scramble yardage. Ultimately, I don't think it's going to impact him enough to where it decreases his overall value. Therefore, Lamar Jackson remains in the A tier as an elite quarterback. Moving on to Justin Fields, another one of these mobile guys. He is the third quarterback in NFL history to surpass 1,000 rushing yards. And even though many of you, including myself, had given up on him after the first 4 weeks of the 2022 season, averaging only 9.39 fantasy points per game, and quite frankly had a 50.8% passing completion percentage within those 4 games, I mean, we thought it was over. But he completely flipped the script as this offense began to really trust Justin Fields and allow him to be the quarterback that he has now become. From weeks 5 through 17 of last season, was averaging 23.49 fantasy points per game and increased his overall passing completion percentage from 50.8% to 63%, and hopefully that number is only going to increase now that you've added receiving options like a DJ Moore, Robert Tonyan to this offense. Hopefully they'll continue to expand upon that, and now that he's within this offense for another offseason, he's only going to learn and get more comfortable with everything at the line of scrimmage, and it's only going to increase his overall potential. Now, if you take his overall production from weeks 5 through 17 of last year, expand that on a per-game average for a 17-game season, we're talking about the potential of Justin Fields being a 400-point fantasy quarterback, similar to the level of guys like Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, and Jalen Hurts. So we know he has the potential ceiling there. It's just a matter of, can his rushing potential get him into the conversation, because we know his passing statistics aren't going to be anywhere close to what those other 3 quarterbacks are able to produce on a yearly basis. Now, one of the primary reasons why Justin Fields was so incredible last season, especially from weeks 5 through 17, primarily had to do with designed rushing yards. From weeks 1 through 4, had 14 rushing yards on designed runs. From weeks 5 through 17, had 408. That is the biggest difference and the reason why Justin Fields became a different quarterback, because they allowed the rushing game and the threat of him moving out of the pocket to be an active participant and force defensive coordinators and defenses to worry every single week. And honestly, they couldn't stop him. I mean, you even go back to 2021. Justin Fields had similar struggles in the idea from weeks 3 through 7 as a starting quarterback of this team, was only averaging 7 fantasy points per game. But from weeks 8 through 15, turned it around, started averaging 19.7 fantasy points per game. There have been times where he'll start slow, but eventually will get his overall stride within an offense and take over. This is a quarterback going into year 3 with an improvement at the wide receiver position. We've talked about this offseason. Justin Fields has a lot of potential. Moving on to Joe Burrow, another one of these quarterbacks that, again, has proven consistency. And over the course of the last 2 seasons, in terms of a passing completion percentage adjusted, has been the most accurate passing quarterback in the National Football League, even though he has had himself a lot of injuries to his receiving core, to his offensive line, and all the pieces around him. Even Joe Mixon missed time last season. Even with all of that taking place, Joe Burrow, regardless of what surrounds him, is one of the best quarterbacks in the National Football League. In the last 2 seasons, averaging 20.78 fantasy points per game, producing 2 or more touchdowns in 26 of his last 32 games, which is an 81% rate. Incredible. In terms of all offenses over the course of the last 2 seasons, the Cincinnati Bengals are number 4 in terms of offensive touchdowns scored per game on average. They're averaging 3.06, number 4 amongst all teams, only behind teams like the Bills, the Chiefs, etc. So if we're in the conversation of, hey, we have a fully healthy offensive line this year, hopefully, an improvement at the left tackle position, primarily because if you compare Joe Burrow to all other quarterbacks last season, only Tom Brady had a faster overall release on passing attempts because he had to get the ball out of his hands quickly because his offensive line was falling apart. Joe Burrow was the second fastest on that list. So if you improve the offensive line, it's only going to help this entire conversation. But the fact that both Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both missed about 3 to 5 games last season, that in itself, getting them back in the lineup consistently for a hopeful full 17-game season is only going to increase the potential of Joe Burrow, a quarterback that in my eyes is capable of 5,000 yards, 37 touchdowns, if not 40. It's just a matter of, can the pieces around him stay healthy? And on top of that, despite the fact that he tore his ACL back in 2020, he is still an active member in the rushing game. When we talk about his overall rushing yards last season, 257 that led to 5 rushing touchdowns. Those overall numbers continue to increase his ceiling of production, which certainly helps for draft purposes in trusting his overall production. Moving on, let's talk about a guy like Justin Herbert. Justin Herbert, again, amongst all quarterbacks in their first 3 seasons of their career, he is number 1 in terms of total passing yardage with 14,089. Last season had the second most quarterback passing attempts amongst all quarterbacks in the National Football League, only behind Tom Brady. And in terms of NFL history, 699 passing attempts that he had last season is 4th all time in the record books. The volume in which he was passing at, I understand they had a 17th game, which certainly does increase those overall numbers, but the volume in which they were passing at, despite the fact that they did not have Mike Williams and Keenan Allen, Mike Williams missed 4 games, if not 5 games, and Keenan Allen practically missed 9 games throughout that entire conversation. The fact that we were still able to see Justin Herbert with limited receiving options. I mean, pretty much Gerald Everett, Austin Eckler, and Joshua Palmer out there being his primary 3 receiving options. With those 3 limited pieces, he was still able to put up pretty good numbers. Now, even though it was a downtick in comparison to his first 2 years, hopefully we're getting back into the right conversation with a healthy receiving core. Obviously, healthy Justin Herbert had surgery on his shoulder this offseason, was dealing with the rib cartilage injury last season. And then you have a healthy offensive line with his left tackle back, his centers back. These are 2 all-pro players or have the potential of being all-pro in their own right. Now you also bring in the first-round receiving option of Quentin Johnston. This offense is only trending in the right direction. Additionally, on top of the fact that they bring in Kellen Moore, who's been associated with the offense with the Dallas Cowboys, who over the course of the last 4 seasons, in terms of total offensive touchdowns, in 2019, they were number 6. In 2020, obviously, Dak missed that season. They were number 20. But in 2021, with Dak's return, they were number 4 overall. And in 2022, they were number 3 overall in total offensive touchdowns. This team has been one of the highest overall ceilinged offenses because of Kellen Moore, his contributions as a play caller, and obviously the talent within that organization. Now, you look at the Chargers, I think they have just as much talent in terms of quarterback play, receiving play, as the Dallas Cowboys have had over the course of the last 4 seasons. So going into this year, Justin Herbert should take a step forward. A guy that since 2020 has been averaging 20.26 fantasy points per game. I think his overall production is going to continue to increase. And even though he was injured last year and his overall rushing statistics were limited because of that rib cartilage injury, trying to avoid getting hit, if you take his averages over the course of the last 3 seasons, we're expecting about 250 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns from him this year, which only helps his overall production. Moving on to Trevor Lawrence. So when we talk about Trevor Lawrence, it's just a matter of, can Trevor Lawrence be as consistent as he was late last season? Because when he began the season, weeks 1 through 10 was only averaging 16.12 fantasy points per game, only put up 16 touchdowns total in 10 games. Then he hit the bye week, and this organization completely flipped as they understood that they had an opportunity of making the playoffs as long as they won out. And that's exactly what they did. From weeks 12 through 18, was averaging 19.21 fantasy points per game and scored 14 touchdowns in 7 games. Now, if you go ahead and eliminate the Week 17 contest against Houston, in which Trevor Lawrence did not play in the second half of that game, only played 60% of the offensive snaps, so basically 2.5 quarters or 2 quarters in a singular drive, we're talking about a 21 fantasy point per game average from Trevor Lawrence at the back end of the season. There is a lot of potential with Trevor Lawrence, especially considering the fact that this is an offense that threw the ball the 10th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League last season. We have Doug Peterson as the primary play caller, the head coach, the quarterback whisperer, a guy who's been able to elevate quarterbacks like Carson Wentz to MVP levels, elevate Nick Foles to win a Super Bowl. And now you bring in Calvin Ridley within this offense, a wide receiver who has proven he can be one of the best in the National Football League back in 2020. When we talk about third-year quarterbacks, similar to Justin Fields, taking that step forward when they get elite wide receiver production, I'm talking about quarterbacks like Josh Allen getting Stephon Diggs, Jalen Hurts getting A.J. Brown, Tua Tagovailoa getting Tyreek Hill, Jared Goff getting Brandon Cooks, Kyler Murray getting DeAndre Hopkins. We're talking about Dak Prescott getting Amari Cooper. When you give young quarterbacks help at the receiving position, it elevates their game, especially in year 3. We're talking about a 20% increase minimum in passing yardage, passing touchdowns, and in overall fantasy points within that third year in comparison to year 2. The overall ceiling of production for Trevor Lawrence, in my mind, is like 4,800 yards, 35 passing touchdowns. He has the ability to get into the conversation of being a B-tier quarterback. It's just a matter of, can he take that step forward and be consistent in doing so? Moving on to Deshaun Watson, the next player within the C-tier. Deshaun Watson actually looked good yesterday in terms of the preseason. Obviously, they got to get a little bit of the cobwebs out prior to week 1, and they're going to have a pretty tough schedule to begin the season, specifically playing against a lot of playoff teams, a lot of great teams in terms of stopping the run. It is going to put the onus on Deshaun Watson to carry this team. They paid him a lot of money, a full guaranteed contract. He has to prove it. I mean, you go back to the last 3 seasons as a starting quarterback in the National Football League, 2018, 19, and 20. He was a top 5 quarterback in fantasy football in all 3 of those seasons, averaging 23.08 fantasy points per game his final year with the Houston Texans. Unfortunately, last year, coming off of the entire suspension, was only averaging 14.26 fantasy points per game. But again, it's just a matter of how this offense is built. They are not going to pass the ball a bunch. Again, amongst all teams in the National Football League since 2020, the Cleveland Browns are 28th in terms of overall passing attempts. Yet we have still seen back in 2020, Baker Mayfield be able to put up a season of 3,500 passing yards and 26 passing touchdowns. So we have a guy like Deshaun Watson here, with receiving help with Amari Cooper, David Njoku, Donovan Peoples-Jones, Elijah Moore, Nick Chubb out of this backfield. I truly do believe 4,000 yards, over 25 passing touchdowns should be in the realm of conversation. And considering how mobile he has been whether it is via scrambles or designed runs, specifically 2017 through 2020. In terms of per game averages, if you expand that upon a 17-game season, we're talking about Deshaun Watson potentially surpassing 500 rushing yards, 5 touchdowns, and getting himself 80-plus fantasy points in terms of rushing statistics alone, which will continue to increase his overall potential. It's just a matter of, can he go ahead and take this offense that has the pieces ready in play with offensive line and the rushing attack, utilize play action, and lift his overall game in comparison to last year. Moving on to Dak Prescott, the next quarterback I wanted to mention. So here's the thing about Dak Prescott. Since 2019, when healthy, averaging 20.74 fantasy points per game, and has scored 33 games of 2 or more touchdowns in the last 47 contests that he's been healthy. That's a 70% rate. Fantastic. He's been a top 12 quarterback in fantasy football every single season he has been healthy. So unfortunately in 2020 and last year, considering he missed significant time, wasn't able to reach the top 12 overall standings. But going into this year, I truly do believe Dak Prescott once again has the opportunity of doing so. Despite the fact that they're losing Kellen Moore, they're going to have Mike McCarthy, Brian Schottenheimer as the primary play callers, offensive coordinator, head coach within this offense. So they're going to be able to continue to throw the ball down the field. And even though Mike McCarthy has said this offseason he wants to run the ball more in order to give his defense more rest, you can only go ahead and say things like that to an extent because game plans are going to change. Scenarios are going to switch up, and this team is absolutely going to continue to pass the ball. This offense elevated themselves this offseason by bringing in Brandon Cooks. It is unfortunate that they traded away Amari Cooper for what they did. What was it, a 5th-round selection? And now they're certainly regretting that departure. I know they owed him a lot of money, but now you got to pay that money to Brandon Cooks. Nonetheless, this is an offense that last season was number 3 in terms of total offensive touchdowns, 52 overall, only behind the Chiefs and the Philadelphia Eagles. In the last 2 full healthy seasons of Dak Prescott's career, we're talking about 2019 and 2021. 2019, 4,900 passing yards, 33 touchdowns through the air. Additionally, 2021, 4,400 passing yards and 40 total touchdowns. Dak Prescott has the potential. He's proven it. He'll continue to do so this year. Moving on. Let's talk about Daniel Jones to begin the D tier. So Daniel Jones got paid a lot of money this offseason. 4-year deal, $160 million, despite only having one good season in his career. In 2019-2020 was the number 24 overall quarterback in both seasons for fantasy purposes. In 2021 was the number 27 overall quarterback, but last year, the number 9 overall quarterback, averaging 18.06 fantasy points per game. And of his 16 regular season games, only 9 of them consisted of 2 or more touchdowns. Now, the reason why Daniel Jones can still be an active participant and still a great fantasy option going into this upcoming season, despite his lack of touchdowns overall, primarily has to do with his lack of overall turnovers. Only had 8 last season in comparison to the first 3 seasons of his career where he would fumble the ball almost nearly every single game. The fact that he increased his adjusted passing completion percentage to 81.1%. So he was far more efficient as a passer. He did not turn over the ball, and he was a significantly better rushing quarterback. Had 120 rushing attempts for 708 rushing yards, 7 rushing touchdowns. I mean, that in itself is 112.8 fantasy points. That's 7.05 fantasy points per game that is just attributed from rushing statistics. On top of the fact that last season, he had 24 rushing attempts inside the red zone for 6 rushing touchdowns. He's going to continue to be an active part. He is discount version of what Josh Allen provides. And now that he is getting an upgrade at the receiving option, specifically bringing in guys like Paris Campbell, Jalen Hyatt, Darren Waller, it is only going to elevate this offense. They also went ahead and made draft picks in order to improve the offensive line, give this man more time. You got to remember, last season, the Giants pass catchers had a 7.8% drop rate, which was 4th worst amongst all teams in the National Football League. You bring in Darren Waller, who in the last couple healthy seasons, 90 receptions in 2019, 107 in 2020. There is potential for this offense and Daniel Jones to take another step forward. Moving on, let's talk about Tua Tagovailoa. So Tua Tagovailoa at the quarterback position, we know when healthy, is a fantastic quarterback option. In the 10 healthy games he played last season, with no concussions, didn't leave the game early, etc., averaged 20.67 fantasy points per game. 6 of those 10 games consisting of 2 or more touchdowns. If you take those 10 games and expand it upon a 17-game season, the averages balance out to 5,000 passing yards, 39 passing touchdowns, and 350 fantasy points. That is the upside of Tua Tagovailoa because the receiving threats that surround him with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle are elevating him to that conversation. He went from being a middling quarterback in 2021 to going into 2022 and being the number 1 overall quarterback in yards per attempt, the number 2 quarterback in average depth of target. He was number 3 in terms of deep passing completions, number 2 in deep passing completion percentage. Again, this is deep passes 20 or more yards down the field. Number 4 in deep passing yards, number 6 in deep passing touchdowns, was number 1 amongst all quarterbacks in adjusted completion percentage, 20 or more yards down the field. only ahead of Geno Smith by a couple percentage. But again, when you're in this top tier conversation and your primary two receivers, Tyreek Hill, 487 yards after the catch, Jalen Waddle, 521 yards after the catch, they are elevating Tua Tagovailoa to this elite level. And of course, for fantasy purposes, we don't mind it. Moving on, we have Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins has been consistent. I mean, that has just been the deal. Regardless of the fact that he doesn't have any mobile upside, he has been able to rank as quarterback 11, 11, and 9 in the last 3 seasons, putting up a minimum of 4,200 passing yards and 31 plus touchdowns in 4 out of the last 5 seasons. Incredible overall numbers. Last season specifically averaged 17.41 fantasy points per game, excluding week 18 in which they did not play their starters for the entirety of that game. We're talking about Kevin O'Connell coming into this offense and allowing them to continue to throw the ball, the 3rd highest passing rate amongst all teams in the National Football League, and had the 4th most passing attempts amongst all teams with 668. Kevin O'Connell purely brought in the entire Sean McVay kind of approach to getting their receivers the primary utilization. I mean, amongst all teams last season, the Minnesota Vikings were number 2 in terms of wide receiver targets. They targeted their wide receivers 407 times. That's 61% of the overall passing attempts within this offense. Obviously, Justin Jefferson took steps forward, and he's only going to continue to take steps forward with Kirk Cousins. And Justin Jefferson, considering he's an elite talent, will go ahead and pull Kirk Cousins into being a relevant fantasy quarterback for sure. They bring in Jordan Addison. They have a full season with TJ Hawkinson. These numbers are only going to grow for Kirk Cousins, and that's why he is in this conversation. Now, one of the primary stats that I don't mention often, but I want to go ahead and do so before we move on from Kirk Cousins, is the fact that last season amongst all quarterbacks, he had the 2nd most passing attempts on play action plays and the 2nd most passing completions. On top of it, had the 5th most passing yards and 3rd most passing touchdowns on play action plays. This purely is contingent on this offensive line staying healthy and Alexander Mattison in the running game being efficient. Because if they're going to continue to be, and they probably will, I think, Kirk Cousins' potential with that play action threat continues to increase. Moving on, let's talk about Geno Smith, the final quarterback in the D tier. The last time Geno Smith was a full-time starter on an NFL team was back in 2014. There had been a huge gap of time from 2014 through 2022, and Geno Smith spent all that time preparing for his moment, and he delivered, putting up a season in which he was quarterback 5 overall, 4,200 passing yards, 30 passing touchdowns, 366 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown. His overall contribution of 17.87 fantasy points per game. I mean, that is an unbelievable number. On top of the fact that he had 12 games of 2 or more touchdowns of the 17 games that he played, that's a 71% rate. Additionally, was the number 1 overall quarterback in football last season in terms of a passing completion percentage with a 69.76%. Amongst all teams in the league, this team didn't throw the ball much. I mean, they were middle of the pack, the 16th most passing attempts amongst all teams. Yet Geno Smith, with the receiving threats that surrounded him, absolutely dominated, mainly because of the deep passing game. Again, we talked about it with Tua and his threats, but DK Metcalf, Tyreek Hill, JSN this year potentially, they're going to be able to continue to be fantasy relevant because of how great Geno Smith was in terms of deep passing. Was number 9 in terms of deep passing attempts, but was number 3 in completions, number 8 in passing yards, number 1 in passing touchdowns with 14 passing touchdowns, 20 or more yards down the field. One of the best quarterbacks in that category, and with the rushing upside, continues to lean in the right direction. Moving on to Anthony Richardson, beginning the E tier. He's a rookie quarterback. He is a freak of nature. 4.40 speed. The 4th fastest quarterback 40-yard dash speed in the NFL history. In terms of next-gen stats, combine statistics, in terms of setting records in broad jump, vertical jump, all these other metrics, he's a 99th percentile combine player, an athlete. I mean, if you want to go ahead and compare him to someone, he's a more athletic version of Cam Newton and Josh Allen. That's purely what he is. Frame, size, everything. But now that you join this organization, and there's probably going to be a conversation of no Jonathan Taylor, the pure upside of Anthony Richardson relies on him and his rushing statistics. Similar to how we lean upon that with other quarterbacks like Justin Fields, we're going to have to lean upon that even more because I don't expect Anthony Richardson's passing statistics this year to be all that great. And that's going to be perfectly fine because we've seen quarterbacks with not all that great passing statistics still be relevant in fantasy. You go back to last season's Marcus Mariota. Within an offense, they ran a lot of RPOs and options and gave him the ability to run the ball a bunch. Marcus Mariota, from weeks 1 through 13, was still the number 12 overall quarterback in fantasy football prior to his season-ending IR stint. Additionally, we have seen quarterbacks like Taysom Hill, who is a jack of all trades kind of, Swiss Army knife, play at quarterback and still be fantasy relevant in those given weeks. Easily, in my opinion, has the potential of top 12 upside. It's just a matter of the matchups you decide to play him in, because some of those are going to be difficult if the rushing yards are locked down and his passing statistics can't carry him. Nonetheless, has a lot of upside because of those rushing numbers. Moving on, let's talk about Aaron Rodgers. I'll be totally honest. When I look back at the history of Aaron Rodgers, where I had him ranked from season to season, back in 2019, after that year, going into 2020, I thought Aaron Rodgers was on the decline of his career. But the fact that he was able to have this revenge campaign of back-to-back MVP seasons, scoring 89 touchdowns in those 2 seasons combined, is unbelievable. Now, hopefully, he's going to continue to go on that revenge tour and accomplish that this season. I mean, even though Aaron Rodgers in 2022 wasn't the best quarterback in terms of fantasy purposes, I think, what was he, like quarterback 13 overall? He still had 3,700 passing yards and 26 passing touchdowns. His bad years are other quarterbacks' highlight seasons. So as we approach the 2023 year, if Aaron Rodgers is able to increase his overall production, he's able to get 4,000 passing yards, 30 passing touchdowns, he'll be far better than where I have him currently ranked. It's just a matter of, can this receiving core that surrounds him elevate him to that level? We know Nathaniel Hackett, the offense coordinator's team, that is his favorite offensive coach in the history of his career. He has said that multiple times on the Pat McAfee show. He loves Nathaniel Hackett. It is only going to help him, and hopefully he wants to kind of prove some revenge against the Green Bay Packers, just to go ahead and prove to them, hey, you guys let me go a little too early, and I'm going to rub some dirt in your eye and show you just how great I am at the quarterback position still. Moving on, let's talk about Jared Goff. Jared Goff last season was incredible, finished as quarterback 10, but only had 283 fantasy points. Again, the fact that he does not have rushing upside certainly limits his potential, but nonetheless, this is an offense that took a huge step forward, and this was the best season for Jared Goff since 2018, the year in which the Rams went to the Super Bowl with him. Overall, this offense took steps forward not only on the ground but through the air. They had the 11th most passing attempts amongst all teams in the National Football League, the 8th most passing yards, and the 7th most passing touchdowns. With Ben Johnson as their offensive coordinator, of course, with MCDC, Motor City Dan Campbell, obviously leading the way in terms of this offense, they're going to continue to be in the right direction behind one of the best offensive lines in the National Football League. Amongst all quarterbacks last season, inside the 10-yard line, Jared Goff had the 2nd most passing touchdowns, only behind Patrick Mahomes. This team is highly efficient down in the red zone, and if this Lions team continues to improve, I only think that Jared Goff is going to kind of probably stay in the same conversation. The only issue is, yes, he was the quarterback 10 last season, but you got to remember, there was no Lamar, there was no Tua, there was no Dak Prescott, there was no Deshaun Watson at a full capacity. Now that you get those guys into the mix, it is going to decrease the overall potential. Even if Jared Goff has a similar season, his current ranking as such is pretty fair. Moving on, let's talk about the F tier. We begin with Derek Carr. Listen, I like Derek Carr a lot as a sleeper second quarterback in a 2 QB league, primarily because he is ranked as quarterback 20, 14, 10, 19, 18, 16, 13, 14, and 17. Ranked as quarterback 17 last season without playing the final 2 games of the season with the Raiders as they shut him down for Stidham. But overall, in the last 3 years with the Las Vegas Raiders organization, averaging nearly 16 fantasy points per game, has been able to put up 2 or more touchdowns in 29 of his last 47 games, a 62% success rate. He goes over to the New Orleans Saints, who have a lot of weapons. The primary reason he went over to the New Orleans Saints is because of Dennis Allen. Used to be a former coach of the Raiders. Obviously, Pete Carmichael has a relationship with Dennis Allen. He's been with the New Orleans Saints since 2012. So if we're going to be in a conversation of just comfort level and the fact that John Gruden is also an offensive consultant with the Saints, that was the perfect spot for Derek Carr to go. He's going to be joining a team that has the easiest strength of schedule and honestly should be able to tear apart defenses with the weapons that they have. Jamal Williams, Kamara, Michael Thomas, Olave, Rashid Shaheed, the plethora of tight ends, whether it's Taysom Hill, Foster Moreau, Jawan Johnson, Jimmy Graham. They have so many weapons that surround Derek Carr. His overall potential is just going to continue to increase in comparison to where he was last season. Again, if he ends up being quarterback 17 again, that's kind of where I have him ranked and kind of my expectation for his potential this year. Moving on, we talk about Brock Purdy. So Brock Purdy, with the weapons that surround him, similarly should benefit. It does not matter who plays quarterback within the San Francisco 49ers scheme. They are always going to produce well. I mean, from weeks 13 through 18 of last season, Brock Purdy averaged 218 passing yards, 2.17 passing touchdowns, 0.17 rushing touchdowns, and 17.5 fantasy points per game. Was able to score 2 or more touchdowns in all 6 of those games and 3 or more touchdowns in 2 of those contests. He was the number 11 overall fantasy quarterback in terms of a fantasy point per game average to close out the season. And in my opinion, he's only going to continue considering he's healthy coming off that Tommy John surgery. And even when you go ahead and take his playoff statistics into consideration, adding the first 2 playoff games against the Dallas Cowboys and Seattle Seahawks, obviously left early against the Eagles, he averaged 18.7 fantasy points per game last season. And when we talk about the weapons that surround him, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, Christian McCaffrey, George Kittle, 4 receiving threats that were all within the top 40 in terms of yards after the catch last season amongst all players in 2022. McCaffrey was number 2, Debo was number 12, Kittle was number 34, and Ayuk was 38. This offense last season had the 6th most yards after the catch amongst all teams. And we're talking about receiving options that, as a combined quartet of these 4 options, they had majority of their work behind the line of scrimmage or between 0 to 9 yards. In fact, 233 of their targets and 187 of their total receptions last season came from behind the line of scrimmage or 0 to 9 yards down the field. This is a team that just gets the ball out of their quarterback's hands and lets the receivers elevate their overall quarterback play, which is absolutely going to be the case as we continue with Kyle Shanahan in this offense. Moving on, let's talk about Matthew Stafford. Matthew Stafford was brutally injured last season. Obviously came into the season with the unfortunate elbow injury and then got crushed because his offensive line was awful. To put this into perspective, Matthew Stafford in 2022 was sacked the 16th most times amongst all quarterbacks last season, 29 total sacks, but he only played 9 games. He was sacked 3.22 times per game. That is an unbelievable number that hopefully we'll never see again. Otherwise, he'll have a very short season here as he'll be heading to the IR relatively soon. But we know that this offense has drafted and even made trades this offseason to bring in offensive line depth who can help protect Matthew Stafford. This is a quarterback back in 2021. 4,800 passing yards, 41 passing touchdowns, a career high in passing touchdowns. But when you compare that 2021 year of averaging 20.16 fantasy points per game, including all games, including the playoff, Super Bowl, etc., in comparison to last year only averaging 12.04 fantasy points per game, that's an 8-point fantasy drop. That's 2 touchdowns worth of fantasy points that disappeared from his overall production per week. So as long as Matthew Stafford could stay healthy, he can be relevant. Also, we need the running game to be, pretty much active. From weeks 1 through 9, when Matthew Stafford was the primary quarterback, in terms of running back rushing attempts, this offense was averaging a 3.28 yards per carry average. If Cam Akers can be far more active and relevant early within this offense, within the beginning of the season, it'll take so much more pressure off of Matthew Stafford because play action will finally work. And defenders can't just pin their ears back, blitz him, and obviously find their way to the quarterback. Moving on, let's talk about Kenny Pickett. I think Kenny Pickett, amongst all these quarterbacks that I mentioned in the F tier, is probably my favorite because I honestly think in comparison to what we saw last year, he'll make the biggest jump in terms of overall improvement. During the preseason this year, he has been 13 of 15 passing, 299 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 158.3 passer rating. Every single offensive drive that he has been on has led to a touchdown this preseason. Additionally, they've improved this offensive line. You have a healthy Najee Harris. You bring in guys like Allen Robinson. Even though they're paying him a lot of money, a veteran presence there certainly helps. You bring in guys via the draft with like Darnell Washington to play tight end, the former Georgia Bulldog. You also have Calvin Austin, who's going to be healthy this year, dealt with the Liz Frank last season. If this offense, offensive line-wise and weapons-wise around Kenny Pickett continue to improve, he's going to take steps forward. He absolutely will. On top of it, he has the mobility factor in comparison to Matthew Stafford, Derek Carr, and Brock Purdy, which elevates his game. Despite the fact that he only played 10 full healthy games last season, Kenny Pickett still had 55 rushing attempts for 237 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. If those numbers continue to increase, so will my trust in terms of his weekly potential averages. Moving on, let's talk about Jordan Love. I think Jordan Love can very easily come in and be the next starting quarterback of this organization, and there's not going to be that big of a drop-off. Sure, in the first couple years until we find more experience under the belt of Jordan Love, there's going to be some learning curve. But Jordan Love has had 3 years to sit behind Aaron Rodgers, and this is his 4th year in the league in 2023 now. Again, he was drafted in 2020. He has learned a lot, and hopefully he's going to be able to apply that this offseason during the preseason. 21 of 33 passing, 193 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 0 interceptions. Has been very good within this offense and hopefully can transition that into the week 1 matchup against the Chicago Bears. With all the receiving threats around him being young, again, Musgrave as a rookie tight end. You have second-year players like Romeo Doubs and, of course, Christian Watson. Their backfield, again, even though Aaron Jones is the most veteran player within this offense at this current moment in time, he's going to only help within the receiving game to help Jordan Love get to that next step. Jordan Love has been an active quarterback. You go back to his days at Utah State. If they want to use his mobility or if he wants to scramble, that would be great, but I don't expect him to do so. He's still a 6'4", 220-pound quarterback who has a 4.7 speed. He has the ability to be mobile. I don't think he'll unlock that potential. I think they're just primarily going to utilize him as a passing quarterback, which they should at this moment. Moving on, let's talk about Bryce Young. Speaking of a learning curve, Bryce Young, again, as the first overall pick, going into this organization who has a new coaching staff and everything, they're bringing in weapons like Thielen, Chark, Mingo, Hurst, Sanders, in order to help Bryce Young immediately. They already have an established offensive line with 4 starters returning in terms of continuity. This is a great thing to see. but can Bryce Young be very similar to the number one overall quarterback selections that we have seen in the past? The first quarterback taken off the board over the course of the last decade of the league. We're talking about back in 2013, guys like EJ Manuel, he finished as quarterback 28. Blake Bortles finished as quarterback 24. Winston, quarterback 13. Goff, 37. Trubisky, 28. Mayfield, 16. Murray, 8. Burrow, 25. Lawrence, 23. Pickett, 28. Quarterbacks going into their first year have not found a lot of success. Now, primarily, Pickett dealt with Trubisky. Lawrence dealt with Urban Meyer. Burrow dealt with the ACL. Trubisky only played 12 games. Goff only played 7. Bortles only played 14. Emmanuel played only 10. If Bryce Young can stay fully healthy for the full season, he could very easily be a top 24 quarterback, and that's kind of where I have him ranked. That's the primary reason. If he's healthy and on the field, he could be top 24. If he's really good to start out the season, he can be top 16 to say the very least. Moving on, let's talk about a quarterback like Ryan Tannehill, who in my opinion, I think is often slept on. Since week 7 of the 2019 season, Ryan Tannehill has averaged 18.05 fantasy points per game, 231 passing yards, a total of 2 touchdowns per game on average, both rushing and passing combined, only 0.58 interceptions per game and about 15 rushing yards per game. So he's been able to get it done on the ground, through the air, and find the end zone consistently. But last year, weeks 1 through 15, in the games in which he was healthy, only a 211 passing yard average in terms of touchdown totals, 1.08 in terms of passing touchdowns, 0.17 in terms of rushing touchdowns, and a 13.44 fantasy point per game average. If you go ahead and remove the couple games in which he left early with an injury, he averaged about 15 fantasy points per game. Still not numbers that we love, but he's still a quarterback that since 2019 has had 38 of his 53 overall games consist of 2 or more touchdowns. That's a 72% rate. In an offense that is going to have a consistent rushing attack, and now that you bring in DeAndre Hopkins, you have a healthy Treylon Burks, and a full workload of Chigoziem Okonkwo, I think the potential is very high for Ryan Tannehill. Moving on to Russell Wilson, Mr. Unlimited. Here's the issue I have with Russell Wilson. I think the best of Russell Wilson is far behind us. His season last year, finishing as quarterback 16, I think he'll probably produce some, significantly less than that, even though he should get better with Sean Payton. Certainly, he should get better. I don't trust it. Jerry Jeudy getting injured does not help the entire situation. Javonte Williams coming off the ACL does not help the entire situation. This team wants to run the ball. They signed 2 offensive linemen, both a right guard and a right tackle. They brought in a fullback. They brought in Samaje Perine. They brought in a blocking tight end. They're trying to run the ball more to get the ball out of Russell Wilson's hands, who at the age of 34 is going into a season where he's probably going to rush the ball far less, even though Joe Lombardi and Sean Payton have been able to elevate their quarterbacks over the course of their careers, whether it's Drew Brees or Justin Herbert in seasons past. I think we're just getting towards the end of his career, and he's kind of falling off that proverbial cliff. Even though back in Seattle, he had been a top 12 quarterback every single healthy season, I just don't see it this year within this offense. Moving on, let's talk about Mac Jones. Speaking of quarterbacks who kind of fell off the proverbial cliff, unfortunately, with Matt Patricia and Joe Judge as the primary offensive coordinator and a quarterback coach, we saw Mac Jones find a lot of inconsistency, on top of the fact that he did not start the entirety of the season, so he was not great last season. But go back to 2021, averaged 14 fantasy points per game with Josh McDaniels. If they were able to elevate that, bringing in players like Mike Gesicki, Ezekiel Elliott, Juju Smith-Schuster, re-signing Devontae Parker, obviously they have the great offensive line, but this is a run-first personnel offense. They're going to utilize the running game with Ramondre Stevenson and, of course, Ezekiel Elliott. So Mac Jones and his overall potential is certainly going to be limited until they bring in more weapons, or specifically designate him to be a quarterback that's going to throw the ball 35 to 40 times a game. Moving on to Kyler Murray. Considering he's coming off the ACL, I don't really have anything else to say besides you might want to stash him as an IR option, but ultimately, considering we don't know exactly what his timeline is to return, we're probably going to be in a situation where you might not even want to draft him or have him on roster unless you play in a 3 QB league, and you're going to only utilize him because both your quarterbacks have a super late bye week, potentially week 10 and beyond, and hope he'd be back by then. Kyler Murray in his career has always been incredible. You go back to 2021, prior to his injury, was the number 6 overall quarterback. You go back to 2022, prior to his injury, was the number 6 overall quarterback in fantasy. Has been incredible since 2020, averaging 22.44 fantasy points per game. He is one of the best quarterbacks in the league for fantasy purposes. It's just a matter of, can he be healthy coming off the ACL without Cliff Kingsbury, with so much change within this offense. No longer having DeAndre Hopkins makes a huge difference. Moving on, let's talk about Jimmy G. There's a chance that Jimmy G gets replaced by the time the season ends. So, to be honest, I'm not going to be surprised if he does, and I'm not going to invest enough in Jimmy G to where I can get burnt in that regard. Bringing back Josh Jacobs certainly helps the upside of this offense, but this is not a team that is looking to win and make the playoffs. They're just trying to get a higher pick in the 2024 draft. And that's why I kind of have, Jimmy Garoppolo low here, because they don't really have much of an allegiance to him outside of the money they paid him this year. They could probably get out of that contract next year. So I'm not too worried about it. I know that Josh McDaniels has a great relationship with Jimmy G. Obviously, both of them were in New England in seasons past, but this is going to be a completely different kind of approach going into this year. They have a lot of weapons surrounding him with Jacoby Myers, Devontae Adams, and Josh Jacobs. If Jimmy G is able to somehow bring some magic into this offense in comparison to what he was able to do with Kyle Shanahan, obviously being limited in a lot of those scenarios with a run-first offense, Jimmy G could be relevant, but I'm not banking on it. Moving on, CJ Stroud. Of all the other rookie quarterbacks we've mentioned, Bryce Young and, of course, Anthony Richardson, he's probably in the toughest scenario, but I know he's never going to get replaced. They're going to let him play the full year. And even though his best receiving options are Nico Collins and Robert Woods, technically, I know there's Tank Dell, there's John Mechie, there's Dalton Schultz. I know there's weapons around him, but they're not good enough for me to be excited about his overall fantasy potential. In terms of real football, I'm hoping the Houston Texans play a lot better this year, but I don't know if that's going to be the case for fantasy purposes. Moving on, let's talk about the I tier. We begin with Baker Mayfield. Played pretty well in the preseason. 14 of 15 passing, 106 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Obviously lit it up with Chris Godwin a couple days ago. Godwin's overall ADP is going to increase. I've been telling y'all for weeks, Godwin's going to be relevant because this offense is going to make Baker Mayfield whole again. Baker Mayfield, back from his 2018 through 2020 days, put up 3,500 passing yards and 22 passing touchdowns minimum each season. You get Godwin, you get Evans. Those are the two best receivers he's ever played with. And Evans is a future Hall of Fame wide receiver. Let's put that into account. Now you bring Dave Canales, the former quarterback coach of Geno Smith, who elevated him to the next level, and you bring him as the offensive coordinator to the Bucs. I think there's a very good conversation where Baker Mayfield can be relevant, but for fantasy purposes, I'm not starting him or drafting him in any scenario here. We move on to Sam Howell. Hopefully, Sam Howell can be relevant. Obviously, Sam Howell, in Week 18 of the 2022 season, was able to defeat the Cowboys going 11 for 19 passing, 169 passing yards, a passing touchdown, 35 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 18.26 fantasy points against the Cowboys defense. In the preseason, 28 of 37 passing, 265 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 0 interceptions, 25.1 fantasy points in the 3 games he participated in. Sam Howell can be relevant for fantasy purposes, but only in a 2 QB league as my third quarterback coming off the bench in circumstances in which it's a bye week. Moving on to the final quarterback I wanted to mention, it is Desmond Ridder of the Atlanta Falcons. I do not trust Desmond Ridder. In the 4 games he started for this organization last season, he was averaging 9.68 fantasy points per game. Even though we could see a trajectory similar to Kenny Pickett where he takes that year 2 jump, I just don't trust him within the offensive scheme. They're not going to let him dominate in the passing game. They're not going to let him run the ball a bunch. He is purely there just to get the ball towards Kyle Pitts, Drake London, and Bijan Robinson. And unfortunately, he is still not able to do that accurately enough. In 4 games last season as a starter, only had 2 total touchdowns. I am worried about Desmond Ridder. He could get replaced by Taylor Heineke. Don't be surprised if that happens. Therefore, he's the final quarterback. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Don't forget, if you guys have not yet already, subscribe to the channel. Click the like button down below. I know this was a long quarterback video, but you guys know I love to mention statistics and give you guys as much information as possible so you can make the most informed decisions for your upcoming 2023 fantasy football draft. The final things I want to mention, of course, check out Underdog Fantasy if you guys have not yet already. Use promo code Andrew. When you sign up today, not only are you going to get that first time deposit match up to $100. So if you deposit 10, the minimum, you'll get 10. You deposit 100, you'll get 100. You can draft teams, play the pick'ems, and of course, gain some experience this offseason responsibly via Underdog Fantasy. Get my draft guide, get the updated rankings, get rankings every single week for weeks 1 through 18 of the 2023 season so we can help you capture a fantasy football championship. Now, last but not least, like you guys can see on screen, whether it's the hoodie that I'm wearing, or perhaps the tie-dye special edition hoodies that are in limited capacity. Again, if you guys want to go ahead and get your hands on the Greetings and Salutations limited tie-dye champion branded hoodies, be sure to go ahead, travel down to the description, head on over to andrewkiorkofshop.com and get them today. They are in limited capacity, so first come and first serve. Thank you very much. Outside of that, of course, we have these hoodies. We have bucket hats, beanies, ball caps, shorts, sweatpants, everything high quality, comfortable, stylish clothing for your most stressful fantasy football Sunday. Support the channel and rep Greetings and Salutations. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.